Hello, I'm Rob Smith. The story we're about to tell you is a bit complex. It takes place over 3 decades, and we're going to do our best to try to not make the timeline too confusing. What's important to remember is there's a bunch of people out there who fear that their birthright is about to get stolen.
Now, a nation is not a nation without land and resources, right?
Ontario Algonquins fear that non-Algonquins have, for the purpose of a land claim, been allowed to sign up for citizenship in huge numbers. Concerns about this have been raised as early as 1999.
The AOO has made a commitment to be inclusive.
One lone ancestor 12 generations back is entirely insufficient.
If they are to be believed, the numbers are quite frankly astounding. Estimates range into the thousands. Non-Algonquins benefiting from a land claim in this age of reconciliation. Pretendianism is a hot-button issue. Usually it involves one person of note, a celebrity, a professor, or a judge. But what if I tell you the Algonquins in Ontario may have thousands of non-Algonquins within their midst? A population explosion made possible because of a land claim. Almost unbelievable, right? Well, that's why APTN Investigates is here, traveling the highways and byways on Algonquin traditional lands in what is now called Ontario.
In 200 meters, you will arrive at your destination.
So this is what I wrote for you, Rob.
Dr. Lynn Gale, an author, activist, Algonquin, battled the feds for her birthright and now sees her community being torn apart from the inside.
Ontario calls this process nation to nation and reconciliation when it really is genocide, right? Well, a lot of the people who were enrolling in these processes were not Algonquin, so these so-called chiefs were just allowing people to enroll.
This isn't us starting from zero, this is us losing.
Dr. Veldon Cobard, professor, researcher, Algonquin, believes the Algonquin land claim opened the door.
So we started seeing a lot come out of the woodwork. Not many, but enough that started to dilute the Algonquin vote.
For decades, a question has hung over the Algonquin. Have non-Algonquins inserted themselves into influential positions in the community?
I've never really liked his work, but he was really
We'll get to that question, but first, Gail puts this story into context.
So the provincial federal order has been imposed on us and divides us. That's an act of genocide. Parliament Hill squats on our territory. That's an act of genocide. Canada and Ontario and Quebec have a long history of denying the Algonquin people who we are and our land and our resources. That's genocide. We did have a very sophisticated system of writing.
Okay, let's slow down. Those are 3 huge topics: genocide, land claims, and pretendians. What exactly is this story about? Spoiler alert, it's identity. Trust me, we'll get there. Let's start to connect the dots with a history lesson.
Ottawa, capital city for 12.5 million Canadians. Symbol of a nation.
During the historic treaty process, we were ignored, and I still am perplexed. How could that happen? And I've come to appreciate that that's because the heart of Canada, the nation state, is squatting on our territory.
Ottawa was born, a lumbering town.
The Algonquin presence jeopardizes the nation state.
The Algonquin have lived in the Ottawa Valley for 8,000 years before French explorer Samuel de Champlain stumbled upon them in 1603. For centuries after, through alliances built or wars with other nations, participation in a fierce fur trade, the Algonquin nation was front and center in almost every historical event leading to the formation of this place, now called Canada.
Now, a nation is not a nation without land and resources, right?
Construction of the capital city destroyed Algonquin villages. Chaudière Falls and Victoria Island are sacred sites accessed through downtown Ottawa. The Quebec-Ontario border splits the Algonquin nation in half. So now, in this age of reconciliation, the Algonquins who reside in Ontario are in a land claim.
You know, I could go into a long process of all the problems associated with the land claim process, but I think you don't really have to think too hard. You can just go, okay, so what's happening at the level of practice? At the level of practice, they're offering us 1.7% of our territory and a $900 million buyout. The Ottawa River, actually, it generates $1 million a day in hydro. And the minerals and the lumber, and then why can't we have a cut of those resources?
To her, the claim has already failed.
I really think that's key. So it's a real problem, of course, pretendianism, but of course, so is the federal and provincial offer, and what is guiding and shaping the process, right? It's Canada and Ontario's economic power that is shaping the Algonquins of Ontario.
To be clear, the Algonquins of Ontario Gail referred to is the umbrella organization tasked in the mid-2000s with negotiating the claim. We have so many questions for members of the Algonquins of Ontario. Everyone we speak to directs us to their lawyer leading the negotiation, Bob Potts. This is the response we got from him. It would be inappropriate for the Algonquin Tribunal or those associated with the Algonquins of Ontario to comment on proceedings. Potts referenced the tribunal. It's an Algonquins of Ontario process designed to investigate inauthentic ancestral claims. Pikwakanagan First Nation, with 3,800 members, 500 live on reserve, the only registered Algonquin First Nation in Ontario. The nation petitioned for a land claim in the 90s, but identity politics had them pull out. The AOO pushed the claim forward with 9 non-status communities. The Chief and Council declined to talk to APTN. Via text, Councillor Don Bilodeau responded, "We are a new Chief and Council. We have a considerable amount of information to digest. We are not in any position to discuss any aspects of our land claim." But back in Ottawa, Professor Veldon Coburn did talk and starts by pulling up a voting list.
All of the the adult Algonquins of Ontario who will be the eligible voters on the ratification in 2016 and the final treaty, which should come up in the next year or two. And I'm looking through, I'm like, I'm seeing names from high school. I'm seeing names of people who hated me as a Indian.
So this is the broadest and maybe silliest question I'll ask you. Who are the Algonquins?
And it's not silly at all. It's been quite diluted lately, especially with this modern treaty of the Algonquins of Ontario and sort of the usurpation of our identity. It's been manufactured in many cases, and in a lot of cases propped up by forged documents.
Dr. Coburn came of age during the rise of Indigenous rights fights in the 90s.
30 years ago, there was still a little bit of anti-Indigenous sentiment from Oka, for example, sharply driven hostilities towards Indigenous peoples, and us laying claim to rights and title really got their backs up. So you could read articles saying, well, look at the Algonquins, they barricaded entry to Algonquin Park. It did fan the flames of anti-Indigenous sentiment growing up.
At this time, the Algonquin of Pikwakanagan began negotiating a land claim. Beneficiaries would include their Algonquin non-status kin.
You hated us. Now you're on this list? Especially Hector Cloutier.
The dogs may be barking, but this caravan is rolling on.
Hector Cloutier was a Liberal MP in the late 90s.
He had made some really unseemly comments on CBC radio during an interview in the early 1990s. Before you start worrying about what's in somebody else's backyard, I suggest you take a look at your own. Many, many reserves, and I say this respectfully, leave a lot to be desired when it comes to proper management and cleanliness.
The explosive issue of racism in politics surfaced today, and both the Reform Party and the Liberals were embarrassed by it.
Let us lay the cards on the table, my friends. They are saying we're not interested in money, and they want to get back to the land, and yet many of them are trying to wring every dollar they can get from the government through subsidies. Some natives say that we are racist, but yet they stridently insist upon keeping and preserving at taxpayers' expense their own segregated minority.
He goes on.
I asked Jean Chrétien at that meeting, personal meeting with him on the Hill, I said, you tell me, Jean, what I said that was against Liberal Party policy on the Aboriginals. He couldn't or wouldn't show me.
And he lived in the city where I grew up, which is only about 15 minutes away from my reserve. We're the closest reserve to what he's talking about. And I'm astonished. I'm like, no way, this guy.
Coburn says he has proof Cloutier shouldn't have been on the list in the first place.
He draws his ancestry to one of the most questionable, this Thomas Lagarde and Sophie Carrière, who have been at the heart of the disagreements since 1999, when they were added, kicked off the list, brought back on pretty quickly, and we left the negotiation tables.
We will have the story of Thomas Lagarde when we return. So you have hope that the youth will take up the ball?
Yeah, well, a little bit, because there seems to be some sort of action. There's some more engaged youth, definitely, from Pikwakanagan.
Before the break, you heard about Hector Cloutier. We attempted to reach out, ask him to respond to statements that his Algonquin status is dubious. We've heard nothing back. He claims Thomas Lagarde as an Algonquin ancestor, a 17th century voyager. Lagarde's heritage has been disputed for over 20 years.
To claim, because in 1999 they came and said, oh, this Thomas Lagarde, he's Algonquin. And we said, no, he's not. So we showed that he wasn't, and then like, oh, okay, so he got kicked off the list. They came back, and this is when we walked away, said no, we're going to put him back on the list. I said, oh, this is enough. The fix is in. Then by 2011, part of the deal was when we came back to the negotiation table is we're going to deal with the question of the root ancestors. And we're like, this one.
At that hearing, this letter shows up with one line saying Lagarde was Algonquin.
Thomas Lagarde, a member of the Masons and also descended from Algonquins. That one statement alone in this forged document magically shows up. So the fallout was the inclusion of a root ancestor who provides legitimacy to over 2,000 individuals who are not Algonquin. More than the voting population of the Algonquins of Pikwakanagan.
A 2021 CBC report put the document under the microscope. It contained historical inaccuracies. A handwriting expert concluded it didn't match the purported author.
I've done quite a bit of research into it. I had been looking for the original document. The church archives cannot confirm it anywhere, and it hasn't been reintroduced in this new tribunal procedures as evidence at all.
Add to that this historical research and analysis done by the enrollment officer for the AOO, released in December 2022. This detailed report dug up marriage, baptism, and census records. 7 generations of the Lagarde family were traced. This family was not identified as Indigenous or Algonquin.
Screenshots of the excerpt.
So, at this point, you might be asking yourself, what happened? The Algonquins of Ontario accept members if they prove a connection to what's called a root ancestor. In this 2015 review, the authors weren't clear what criteria determined one. The AOO created the master list while negotiating the claim. According to the summary, 10 of those root ancestors' only connections date back 200 to 300 years ago. At the time, 3,000 voting members' ancestry was called into question.
Was that INEC refuses to disclose evidence of policy so they can be properly adjudicated.
The relative ease of acceptance into this claim stands in stark contrast to the battle Lynn Gale waged to regain her identity.
Well, my grandmother and her family were escorted out of the community. It was called Golden Lake at the time because of sex discrimination in the Indian Act. They were deemed no longer Algonquin. They were deemed white people. So this is
for those not in the know, that's because her great-grandmother married a white man, branded non-status, an unwanted inheritance for Gale, who felt the sting of rejection from her people.
I was not welcome in the community.
In 1985, Canada amended the Indian Act, removing the sexist provisions that forced Gale's grandmother off her homelands. But at the same time, the changes secretly removed provisions that allowed children of unknown or unstated paternity to remain Indian.
Unknown and unstated paternity, and through the 1985 amendments, the Indian Act became suspiciously silent.
That meant Gale remained non-status because, as it turned out, her grandfather's ancestry was unknown. After a decades-long court battle, she won the right to reclaim her status in 2017.
And then I applied for membership with Algonquin of Pikwakanagan First Nation, and they accepted me. Lake, if it's using
an ordeal that's given her a unique perspective on identity.
Canada's legislation has really messed up identity. Right? Identity is Indigenous identity is very, very political.
It is not possible to be enrolled in the Algonquins of Ontario with only distant heritage, as has been suggested.
There may be a divide outside the AOO, but within its ranks, publicly at least, the organization is united. In February 2021, outgoing Pikwakanagan Chief Wendy Jocko shot a video message directed at Ottawa City Council.
The AOO has made a commitment to be inclusive and not to confine their membership to the dictates of the piece of repressive colonial legislation that is the Indian Act.
Ontario and Canada want to extinguish our rights to the land. They don't want a group of non-status people to come back in 50 years and say, you didn't negotiate with us.
Both sides of the negotiations wanted to include the non-status.
There are legitimate non-status people out there.
And the trouble we're seeing may be unintended consequences.
These new sort of pop-up communities, which have no geographic, territorially bound boundaries of any kind. They, at that particular time, were at best a cheap website and fill out an application form and you can become a member of, say, the Bonachère Algonquin First Nation, as they retitled themselves. They had existed since the 1970s and were formerly the Bonachère Métis Association and restyled themselves as an Algonquin First Nation.
By chance, we came across the Charlotte First Nation Cultural Center sign. When we pulled up, it was closed. But we did notice an address for further down the highway.
Hello, Chief. This is Rob from APTN calling.
I was able to leave a message for the chief, and we talked by phone on the last day of my trip.
We have put in place a beneficial criteria that's defendable, that took many hours and hours of deliberation between all 16 of us to come up with something that we thought, not perfect, far from perfect, but that we thought that we could move forward with, credible, put a credible tribunal in place.
One lone ancestor 12 generations back is entirely insufficient.
If there was, with the tribunal coming up, found to be non-Algonquins, would that put the entire land claim process, does it taint it? Would you guys have to stop it and fix things?
No, why would we? We didn't in 2013. I lost 700 members of my community. It didn't change my community. It didn't dissolve my community. That's the big difference here, is that you might never be part of this treaty, but it's not meaning that you did not have an Algonquin ancestor.
There is an agreement in principle in place ready to be ratified in the next year or two. This despite Pikwakanegan's voting it down in 2016. Bad feelings remain. When we visited, this sign was the first thing we saw, and community members were quick to tell us that the AOO had to relocate a meeting this one time off reserve after these protesters showed up.
Well, why are these people that are
Coburn recognizes an element of the bizarre.
I have a difficult time understanding who would have lived their entire life and even into adulthood say, you know what, I'm going to be Algonquin. I'm envious of them, or perhaps I just want to sabotage them.
But Chief Davis says, hold on a minute. Real people could be hurt by false accusations.
It's very difficult and it's very emotional for people. And I just hope people are sensitive to this and stop calling people pretend Indians. Could you imagine if somebody was judging you? That would be very difficult. If you thought that you were Irish and then all of a sudden they said, no, there's absolutely not 1 ounce of Irish blood in you. Or the fact that your ancestor way back in Ireland means nothing.
I'm sort of half settler, I'm half white. Found out I had a Scottish ancestor. 2014, I believe they had a referendum to secede from the United Kingdom. That was not enough to entitle me to have political rights and be a member of the political community.
Davis says despite what happens at the tribunal, the claim will move ahead. Coburn relents, saying the feds and the province see no reason to stop.
I think that it's convenient. They just want to get to yes.
Well, the Indian Act is still around. So it's a 30-year process.
And let's go back to Dr. Lynn Gale for the final word, a final note of perspective on this entire ordeal.
That's the most recent one. I think to get a seat at the Algonquins of Ontario table. It was a total situation of chaos, and we weren't behaving well. How would we, how would you expect us to behave in the context of genocide and structural oppression? A lot of this has to do with the fact that new settlers came to this land and their identity was taken away from them, and imposed on them was state nationalism, which is just a very thin veneer of in terms of identity, and state nationalism is a fiction. It's a recent fiction, and it doesn't sustain people. It doesn't give them the stories and the songs and the rituals needed to sustain themselves. They almost like have an identity gap within them, and then they appropriate Indigenous identity.
The organization responsible refused to talk to us until very late in this production. The Algonquins of Ontario assured us that the criteria to prove rights as an Algonquin is stringent. Those criteria were created in 2020. But remember, this has been an issue 2 decades old by that time. A tribunal will convene in the next couple of months to investigate this entire situation.